Donna Schwartz here from the Everything Saxophone Podcast. I'm so happy to have Kyle Brooks on. Now, Kyle just released his debut album called Monarch. Monarch, let me say that better. And so we're going to definitely be talking about that. We're going to be talking about a whole bunch of other things too. He's got a very interesting background and he does some very interesting things. So, hey, Kyle, welcome to the Everything Saxophone Podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Donna. I'm really excited to be here, and yeah, I hope we can have a really nice conversation about some of what's led up to the album. My background and what led me to this point.
Let's dive in. Let's talk about your background and how this has led up to this point. So, when was the first time that you started getting involved in music? Because for a lot of the guests, it wasn't on saxophone, it was on piano or something else.
Yeah, I guess I fall into that camp too, actually.
Oh,
My first musical experience was actually when I was 5. My mom got me one of those like first stacked guitars, the small ones, and the first music I was ever learning was like AC/DC songs, like
oh, cool.
Back in Black and Highway to Hell and that stuff.
Wait,
I
wait,
grew
wait.
up
At 5?
maybe a little bit older, but I
Okay.
mean like 7 or 8. But I was definitely introduced to that music at a very young age. A lot of like 80s rock and punk music. That's kind of what I heard around the house.
That's cool.
My my dad was very much into 90s industrial music, like Depeche Mode and
Oh,
that's
cool.
the Cure and that sort of stuff. So it's, musically it was dark undertones around the house for sure.
I have to say, I like Depeche Mode.
Yeah, me
I
too.
like
Me too.
Yeah, I like some of that stuff, and I'm a child of the '80s, so I also like some of the '80s stuff. Although I'm more like a Journey and REO Speedwagon, type of thing, and Styx and all that kind of thing. That's so funny.
Yeah. Yeah. And then yeah, that led to me joining the band in 4th grade and was handed, what's funny was the first instrument they handed me was a cornet, and I could not get a sound out of the thing. And they're like, all right, here's a clarinet. Maybe you'll get a sound out of that. And I tried and I stuck with the clarinet for a year, and I was like, I struggled a lot, but that led to me picking up the saxophone a year later. And it's funny because going through middle school and high school, I really just wanted to play guitar. Like I wasn't really passionate about the saxophone yet. I was just in it because my mom wanted me to do band and all this stuff. And, she kept going, just stick with it, just stick with it, just give it another year, just give it another year. And, reluctantly I stuck with it. And then in high school I started taking jazz improvisation lessons with Nate Lapine, who's a well-known saxophonist in Chicago. He kind of does like the avant-garde Dewey Redman sort of thing. Um, and he was really the catalyst to me being like, oh, this is really cool. I want to do this. And then I also had a high school band director who was a saxophonist as well. And he was the first like really beautiful alto sound I ever heard. And
Interesting.
ever since I heard him play in person, I knew I wanted to be an alto player.
So it sounds to me like, what really one of the things that really influenced you were, in a sense, in terms of the saxophone, the teachers at school, and it wasn't really until high school, more so than anything else, that the sound like gripped you in compared to um wanting to play guitar since 5, and I
Yeah.
mean there's so many, you know, guitar is more prevalent, in society, and you're seeing all these examples of people and all that kind of thing, and not so well. You're pretty young, which I will say this because you're pretty young, you haven't seen saxophone as much as guitar and stuff like that. People that are the older generations have, because saxophone was more predominant in popular music, or
Mhm.
jazz standards, or like you heard classics with King Curtis and with Junior Walker on the radio, where people growing up in the 80s and 90s. In the 80s, we heard the rock sax solos, but the 90s, it really, as much as I love grunge music and stuff, there's no saxophone in that. And so you're not having that kind of effect. So I could see, where the interest would be in guitar. But that's really cool that your high school teacher, I'm curious, your high school teacher really influenced you in terms of the sound. I'm curious though, in terms of Nate Lapina, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So he taught you improvisation. Was he a saxophone player too?
Yeah, he was a tenor player. And he just happened to be the resident private lessons saxophone teacher at the school. And so, he was my first saxophone teacher. And it was a lot of just saxophone technique and improvisation, me just trying to connect the dots here, especially like learning from a tenor player, I would go on to, do that even to, the present day, learning from tenor players. So I was learning to sort of like, okay, he doesn't play the same instrument that as me, but he's got, a lot to offer and, can very much help me out. And me being in that sort of 14 to 18 range, still figuring a lot of stuff out, So no, and he's been one of the biggest mentors I've had in my life. And he came out to one of my album release shows, and he's still just a really beautiful force in my life.
Oh, that's awesome. That's so cool when you think about that. That's really awesome. All right, so we're fast forwarding high school. You're starting to get more into the saxophone and all that kind of thing. When did you decide, like, saxophone was going to be it for you and music was going to be the direction you were going to go?
Mm, mm. Yeah, it was probably around junior year of high school where, it's, the whole career fair thing, what do you want to major in, I was pretty adamant on going to college, which I know is not a thing for everybody, but I really wanted to do it. And my my hunch was to major in music education so I could, perform. But at the time, I didn't really see myself having the prospect of being a career saxophonist. I just wanted to be a career musician and in turn a career music educator. So that led me to deciding to apply for music education programs. And I ended up going to Northern Illinois University and did a double major in music ed and performance.
Oh, okay, so you still kept the performance with the college degree as well, probably to take advantage of taking lessons and stuff.
Yeah, it was exactly that. With the music ed thing, I wasn't allowed to take any jazz classes.
Oh,
So,
that stinks.
so yeah. So by virtue of being a performance major, that granted me access. And at the same time, being a music ed major, that granted me access to having classical saxophone lessons as well. And, that was a huge thing for me. Granted, it was a little overwhelming taking from two teachers at the same time, but
Yes.
I really value both sides of it, even to the present day.
I've got to ask you about this because um when I was in college, I was taking lessons from two different I play trumpet also, two different trumpet teachers and different approaches for sure, definitely different approaches. So let me ask this first question. How did you handle that in terms of, like and what I mean by different approaches in this sense, you had classical and jazz. There's going to be different I think some people will have different approaches to embouchure unless they're, maybe following Joe Alled's methodology or something like that. So you have that aspect, but you also have different approaches in terms of how to work on things. And yeah, so how did you handle that?
Mm, mm. Yeah, I kind of treated it like playing two different instruments. I had an entirely different embouchure concept for classical saxophone than jazz. I had an entire different setup, different mouthpiece, different reed, different ligature.
Wow.
Um, and so, when I when I was in the practice room, I was like, okay, you're gonna do 2 hours on classical, 2 hours on jazz, and I just really tried to keep the two separate as much as possible.
That's hard. That's hard to do.
Yeah.
But you managed to do that. And did it um two different setups. And again, for some people this is totally normal and they're going to do that, especially, nowadays a lot of classical musicians are venturing out, doing some jazz, doing some improvisation and that kind of thing. So they will use different setups. Before college though, you were just on one setup, I'm assuming.
Right, right.
Okay, and what
Well,
kind of yeah, go ahead.
I in high school, at first I was on the same setup for everything, just like the Selmer S80, for everything. And then I got my first Meyer alto mouthpiece around like junior year of high school, I want to say. So it took me a little bit, but eventually I started to separate the two. And that was really by the suggestion of Nate, saying like, hey, there's this setup is made for jazz musicians for a reason. It's got the larger tip opening, the open chamber, allow it to push more air. And then, those S80 mouthpieces have that smaller square chamber, which is ideal for getting a more like rounded, darker sound conducive to classical playing.
Got it. And then did you continue with that setup in college or did you tweak it?
I tweaked it a little bit. I switched mouthpieces for both at different points. Uh, I changed my jazz setup maybe my sophomore year. It was because my teacher Jeff Bradfield still is a Diodario endorsed artist, and he got them to send some mouthpieces for me to try and purchase, so that led to me finding a nice Diodario mouthpiece. I ended up playing on that for 8 or 9 years. And then I believe it was sophomore year, my classical saxophone teacher, Dr. Jessica Maxfield, uh, ended up having me switch to a Selmer S90 mouthpiece for classical. And I still have it and still use it for the occasional classical gig I may get.
Got it. And this S90, I'm assuming that's the tip opening size. I'm assuming it's just a bigger tip opening compared to the S80.
Right, right.
Yeah, I don't play the Selmer, so I'm not aware of that. But all right, so you're
Sure.
keeping with the Selmer, S90. Since we're talking about this now, like which reeds were you using?
Well, I was playing on those old school Rico jazz selects that came in the black and red box, and I know those are now discontinued. Um, and then I switched to the new version, the Diodario version, when it came out. I believe that was like around 2014 or so. I've then switched around a lot since then. But then on classical, I was using Van Doren V12s. So it was kind of battle of the brands for me.
Okay, the V12 instead of the blue box.
Yes, yes. I really liked, they sit a little bit harder than the blue box, and I appreciated the sort of complexity of the sound I was getting. I've always been, even to this day, I'm really biased towards more resistant setups, a harder read. Um, Sometimes I like a slightly smaller tip opening. Nothing crazy, but I think I was playing jazz on blue box reeds for Monarch when I recorded that album. I recorded
Wow.
that on Yeah, I recorded that on an auto link mouthpiece and a 3.5 blue box. So a pretty
Wow.
resistant setup.
Yeah, so talk to us a little bit about why you do prefer more resistant setup.
For me, it having something to blow against allows me to control the tone and the tuning a little bit more. I think the tuning more than anything else because, especially in my undergrad and my master's, I struggled really heavily with just getting my upper register not super sharp. So having the added resistance just allowed me to pull down a little bit more and have a little bit more. It sounds counterintuitive when I say it, when it's coming out of my mouth, but when I have more to blow against, it allows me to flex a little bit more. So I'm able to pull the tuning and adjust it in the higher register as I need to. I noticed that when I play on, especially with unfiled reeds, like the Jazz Selects, for example, they're
Mhm.
super like easy to play and I can get my sound out of it quickly. But I find them to not be as versatile as I need them to be in terms of both the sound and the tuning.
That is really interesting. Okay, and that's probably why you chose on the album to not use those, right? And because you wanted more control. When you do gigs, though, do you go back to the D'Adarios or are you sticking with the blue box?
I actually stuck with the blue box for a good while. I actually just, what's funny is that I started working at PM Woodwind Repair up here near Chicago in Evanston about a month ago. And while I was working there, I got to like try a bunch of different things, try some sample reads and stuff. And just about 2 weeks ago, I switched to Van Doren V21s, which is another classical reed. Um, but the interesting thing is it's a unfiled classical reed, meaning the reed has that U cut to it.
Okay.
Um, and that allowed me it got me the sort of projection and complexity of the sound I was getting with the blue box reeds, but they were just a little bit easier to play. You know, they were just taking my sound a little bit more.
This is interesting. Okay,
Yeah.
comparing the V21s to the blue box, okay, like the tip, is it a little less resistant, you would say?
Yes. Yeah,
Okay.
definitely. The
Okay.
V21s run a little bit softer than the blue boxes.
Got it. Okay. But you still feel like you get the complexity that you would from the blue box. It's just maybe a faster response.
Yeah, yeah, no, precisely. And playing on a 5-digit Mark 6, the low end has some like response issues. Like I play a 74,000 Mark 6, not to get too nerdy about this, but
Yeah.
the end of the short bow, well, really all of the short bow Mark 6s had issues with response in the low B and the low B flat, more so the low B than anything else. So, when I switched from the blue box to the V21, it allowed me to really like dig into that subtone in those low bell tones and really drastically improve the response. It was very noticeable.
I'm just jealous that you have a 5-digit Mark 6. Mine, I have a tenor and an alto, and they were both made in 1968, one 1969. So, they're
Oh
definitely six
wow.
digit for sure. Hey, I love those horns.
Hey, they're
They have this,
still great.
oh yeah, they're still great. They're older than me, but they're great,
Yeah.
they're certainly old. Yours is certainly older than you for sure, but, so talk to us a little bit about like the Mark 6, you mentioned short bow. Some people may not be totally aware of that. Just some of the characteristics.
So looking at the bow of the horn, this is the bow connects the bell to the body tube. The first run had these short bows. And so these, we'll learn later that, these weren't the optimal bow length. As the production went on and we got into about 1960 to 61, Selmer came out with the longbow. And you can tell longbows because if you look at the bell brace connecting to the body tube, they'll sit just a little bit higher. And
Got
so
it.
with the medium bow horns, those had a little bit better response and intonation. And then, it's funny is, those did well for a while. That's in that sort of desirable serial number range, about like 76,000 to around 100 to 120,000.
Okay.
I'm I I'm reluctant to say very specific serial number ranges because the information you get, the data is vastly varied.
Oh, okay. Interesting.
Yeah, I've noticed several inconsistencies in between, the sort of data logging of the bow lengths. So, because on some sheets they'll say that it started it with around the 74, 75,000 for the medium bows. Some might say it started around the 80,000. The data is inconsistent.
Okay.
So, so I try
Got it.
to be very careful with that, you know what I mean?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And so then you have the period of the short bow, right? And then the
Mhm.
medium bow, and then the longer bow happened
Yes.
after approximately the 120,000s and stuff.
Right,
And that's
right.
where you see the bell brace at different heights and stuff like that.
Yeah, exactly. And it's funny because at the end of the Mark 6 run, Selmer actually went back to using the medium bow for the last couple thousand horns because they later learned that those, had the best acclaim, so to speak.
Got
But,
it.
these are very minute differences. With my short bow, what I do is I use one of these Neotech little donuts. I just keep it in the bell like that.
Okay.
And having more mass in the bell, excuse me, allows me to access the low B and B flat a little bit easier. The response is a little bit easier, and it brings the pitch down actually, because the short bows tend to sit sharp on that. So getting a little bit flatter does help. The other thing I do is, this is kind of goofy, but I keep a wine cork in the bell as well.
A wine cork. Wow. Okay.
Yeah, just for more material to what it to get a little sciencey is that what it does is you're elongating the sound waves for any notes being played beyond a low D or C sharp, because that bell is sitting right here, right by your low E flat. Well, really, the lowest note you're going to get before it is you're going to be your low C and low C sharp, right?
Yeah.
So all that added material just helps bring the pitch down on it.
You don't find, it's interesting because one of my students, she had, purchased a horn from one of the local places over here in Los Angeles and stuff, and they told her she was having a problem with the low notes. They told her to put her mouthpiece cap or something in the bell, and I was like, that's really bizarre, but it helped because the low
Yeah.
no, low notes weren't coming out. But I mean, the thing I was thinking about, you've got to worry about like, or do you, with the wine, at least the wine cork, that's not as loud as a mouthpiece cap. I'm just thinking about the sound rattling in the bell and stuff like that.
Right, right. And because the wine cork is it's pretty soft, so you don't hear it vibrating or anything like that. I recommend that to my students instead of the mouthpiece cap thing,
Yeah.
especially on alto, because with those mouthpiece caps, they're not quite, but they're almost getting to a similar diameter as the bell brace. So it's really there's a risk of it getting lodged in there. And then also if it's touching both sides of the tube, that's going to increase the likelihood of it vibrating.
That totally makes sense. And but let's also just so so people know, it's not like we're saying throw a wine cork in the bottom of your bell for every single saxophone, right? This is only in certain,
Exactly.
yeah. This is, for particular situations with this Mark 6, but have you seen this in other horns, or why would people want to put a wine cork in if they don't have a Mark 6?
Yeah, I mean, it totally happens in other horns, especially vintage horns. And I would probably mostly recommend doing it if you have a horn that has the low two notes, the low B and B flat, if they're either having response issues or if they're sitting sharp. Usually it's kind of a both situation. Um, so that to just sort of bring the pitch down and ease up the response a little bit, especially when you have a softer, smaller material like a wine cork in there. That's going to help. That's just going to help the horn resonate a little bit without dampening the metal, because it's not too much material, without dampening those vibrations, so to speak.
That's an awesome tip. And I just want to add to this too, just keep in mind, everybody, that, if you're running sharp on different brands of horn, you also want to check your embouchure too. This isn't like, oh,
Yeah.
I'm running sharp, or I'm not going to pay attention to my embouchure. I'm just going to throw the wine cork in. That's going to solve all my problems. It's not that. It's if your embouchure is fairly solid and your horn's checked out, all that kind of things going on, but those two low notes tend to run sharp. Try it.
Yeah, I will say do a couple of years of really consistent long tones before you make a long-term decision. I mean, obviously, if try it, and if it works for you right away, great. But also that my decision to do this came after, getting out, it was after I got out of grad school, after studying with David Bixler, who is one of the biggest sound guys I've ever met. He, we were doing long tones in and out of the lesson. That became such a core part of my practice routine that um, it got to the point where I was like, okay, I've exhausted everything I could possibly do with my embouchure or my voicing or my breath support, you know. So not to say that there's a finite amount of things you can do to help your sound, because there's not. But, it got to the point where I was like, okay, I need to try something different. And this just happened to help me.
I think it's a fantastic tip. And just a little knowledge that you shared, I think it's going to help a lot of people, especially a lot of people do play vintage horns, not just the Mark Sixes. And,
Hmm.
there always are those intonation problems that happen. The more modern horns are much better with the intonation, the good quality brands and stuff like that.
Yes.
But yeah, with the vintage horns, it's just something to keep in mind, and just some, tips and stuff like that. Thank you so much for sharing that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Cool. I know we went into left field. So, yeah, so we were talking about, like your setups and all that kind of thing and handling, you know, two different teachers, classical, jazz. You were able to separate that out, which is really good. That can be really hard to do. I have to just say that. I know that from my own experience. But that's awesome that you were able to do that. But I think it also may have given you more of a perspective in two ways. Number one, as a teacher, for your students as well, but also in terms of like the sound that you want to create for you, going across all the spectrums and stuff like that, and how you want to put your voice out there.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the the pedagogy thing is has been huge for me because my teaching I've been teaching since I was 16. That's when I had my first private student, and I'm always thinking of, like, do I really understand this? Can I explain this to a 5-year-old, when it comes to all these different techniques? That's the question I'm always asking myself. I actually just started teaching this semester at Triton College, so it's been a lot of really like it's soul searching. I'm like, okay, like, all right, do what do I need to fix here about my teaching, and what am I doing well on the other hand of that? I'm trying to just a big theme of this semester has been finding that balance of both, being critical with myself and identifying what I need to keep working on, but also identifying my strengths as both a performer and a pedagogue.
And also, I think too, identifying the strengths in terms of what's landing with the students and understanding how people learn, because people have a vast array of learning styles. I think it's more pronounced now than it was, a few decades ago. I do think so. But it's also
Yeah.
being able to understand, where the students are coming from and what, their backgrounds. Their backgrounds, a lot of people I'm finding, even when they're going to college, they don't have the typical background of, you know, learning in school or having enough experience in school, and occasionally I know we've had a whole bunch of college teachers on here where, some students were self-taught. Yeah, so you've got that to deal with it as well. And, again, you just started teaching at Triton College. I'm wondering if you've run across some of that.
Oh yeah, definitely. The range of backgrounds I've come across is was, admittedly a little jarring at first because, I spent 10 years in college at, schools where, everyone there like had a musical background and was, really they had skill isn't the right word, but just they had a lot of tools at their disposal. At Triton, it's a very diverse, both economically and, culturally, and working with students who took the bus from the group home and don't have access to the resources that other students might have. And on the same side of that coin, a lot of students who have never touched an instrument in their life, but they, all of a sudden they want to, learn a little bit about jazz or like play in the band just to see how it feels. So having this super broad range has been really it's challenging for sure, but also, it's so rewarding. I absolutely love working with these students. And we feed off of each other. I challenge them, they challenge me, and I try to package it in a way that's in as nurturing and as encouraging as possible while, setting a high standard and being like, hey, like this is great that you want to do this, let's identify what your goals are. And, I'll make a decision on how intense I am with certain students from there. Because not all those students have aspirations to become the next great performer on whatever instrument that it is. So, like the big band I teach, for example, is the average age is, in mid to late 50s. It's a lot of older community members who have been playing in the band for decades
Wow.
and, just want to enjoy playing their instrument.
Okay, that's so interesting because I'm thinking to myself, the question I was going to ask you, then are you getting people that like never played, for example, never played a saxophone before, and now they're playing, and you're starting them off?
Not on the saxophone at the moment, but we do have one or two in the rhythm section. We have a drummer and a bassist who haven't really played they haven't played those instruments before.
Wow.
So they're they're taking lessons, which is helpful, because I help them as much as I can, but like like bass, for example, I'm not a seasoned bassist, so there's only so much I can do. But, I make notes to them. I'm saying like, hey, maybe go check this out, or here's an idea you could take to your private teacher and you guys work on that in the lesson and then bring it back in here.
Got it, got it. And I'm just curious. Okay, so your position at Triton College, so it sounds like you have one of the things is this big band, but it's for people that are also community members that, maybe comeback players or, just picked up the instrument a few years ago, and want to play big band music and all that kind of thing. But you're also getting the younger students that are like 18, 19 coming in and possibly being music majors or music ed majors and that kind of thing.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I mean, the thing with Triton is that while it's not like the biggest music program, we do have a very well supported uh, music program for non-majors. I should rephrase that in that we don't have a huge base of solely music majors, but some of them are in the big band with us, and what I admire so much about them is their willingness to learn and their willingness to be challenged, especially when there's this new arena, especially with being asked to improvise. That's the big thing for me, is that a lot of these students have never improvised on their instrument before.
Yes.
So as even with the older community members, so it can be a little bit, pulling teeth sometimes, being like, hey, I'm gonna get you to take a solo. You've never taken a solo before, but let's just do it. Let's have some fun, no judgment, and we're growing slowly but surely. I'm obviously, I'm being careful not to be too pushy about it, especially it being my first semester on faculty there. But
Sure.
I'm very grateful for the sort of reciprocation I've experienced from those students, especially with the community members. Some of them have been playing in that same big band for 20 plus years, and the director who I'm replacing had been there for 20 plus years and just recently retired. So, while, I'm bringing in my own unique take on jazz that I've accumulated from my time in school and my time on the scene in Chicago, Indy, and Toledo. Um, it's going to be different. There's going to be things that not everyone's going to agree with, but it's funny is that I try to spend time with especially the community members outside of school, like exchanging emails, and like sometimes they'll call me and stuff, and we'll talk about like, okay, like what do you want out of this experience? And most of the time is like, I just want to play some bassy. I just want to play Shiny Stockings or Bassy Straight Ahead,
Got it.
and I'm like, all right, I can work with that. I can work with that. So the challenge is pushing these guys to, really, you know, have the work ethic to, set time aside out of their own personal lives to practice the music. You know.
And get out of their comfort zone.
Hmm. Hmm.
I'm curious. So let me ask the question then. How do you approach these students? How do you get these students to improvise? Like, maybe none of them, they've been in the big band, they're comfortable. How are you starting to get them to improvise? What are you doing?
Sure. I mean, I like to start them out with just a rhythm. We start with a little bit of call and response. This is where, my experience working with Ronald Carter comes in. I used to do the jazz camps back at Northern Illinois University, and he would be like, just tap your foot and play. You could play one note, but it's got to mean something. So, everything goes back to the blues. So a lot of times, like I won't have them pull a chart out. I'm gonna be like, all right, we'll just I'll write out the chord changes to the blues on the board, and I'll have the rhythm section walk and just say, hey, we're gonna start. Here's one rhythm. Just play it back to me. We'll do a little call and response. I'll take one chorus that uses just that one note, but in unique rhythmic fashion. and then have someone else do it. You know, I like to think about it as like it's analogous to bowling with the guardrails on. You know, that like I try to limit as many variables as possible so that the novice student doesn't get overwhelmed. So saying like, hey, you're going to take a course, but all you're going to play is one note, or, you know, or say you're only going to use the blues scale, for example. That's eventually what it leads up to, you know. And then we go back and like, all right, now let's talk about voice leading. Let's talk about playing changes. I mean, we're not even at that level yet, but I'm trying to pace it in a way that, you know, they're able to really digest one thing at a time. Playing with rhythm. Okay, now I'm going to learn how to really like use this blues scale effectively. What does it mean to play the minor third over a major third? You know, what is the blue note? You know, really just trying to make sure they have time to digest each concept, you know. And it's out of their comfort zone for sure, for sure. But, you know, it's a matter of trusting in each other. You know, I trust in them that they're going to put themselves out there and take a risk. And, you know, it's a it's a low risk, high reward situation, I like to think. And because if they if they play and they something weird happens or like they mess up the rhythm, it's all right. We just keep going. We just keep going when the form keeps going. But, you know, if they play something they like, you know, a lot, what I really like to do is when I hear some, like a novice improviser play something that was, you know, effective, like whether it was like a really concrete rhythm or a really nice use of the blues scale, I'll stop. I'll stop right there. I'll be like, what did you just do?
Good. That's
Do it
good.
again. You know, make sure that wasn't a fluke. You know, to really just ingrain it, get it deep in, you know, really building up those myelin fibers, get a neurological.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. And it's, you know, you're making it safe, you're making it supportive
Yeah.
because I always talk about this all the time. You know, improvisation is like public speaking on steroids, you know? And people, the biggest fear in their life is to do public speaking, not dying, but
Yeah.
public speaking. So, you know,
Hmm.
you can imagine, um, you know, especially if the average age of your band members are in their 50s and stuff, and they've never had the opportunity to improvise, you know, there's a lot of baggage that comes with that.
Yes. Yes. I mean, especially with musicians who are predominantly classical musicians,
Oh
is
yeah.
that I've seen this so much as they build up an inherent bias towards the concept of improvisation, the concept of jazz. And usually it's our own fault. It's because someone, you know, said something nasty to them or like wasn't encouraging enough to them. And now they've that left a, especially when you're doing something as vulnerable as improvising, that leaves a bad taste in your mouth early on. You know, you're not going to be motivated to go back and keep working at it, you know. So
Yeah.
that's why when I see people, you know, talk bad about jazz musicians and improvising, it's like on the one hand it stinks, but on the other hand I understand where they're coming from.
Yeah, and it's unfortunate, you know,
Yeah.
and I mean, just the general state of affairs now, you know, just the level of nastiness is just at an all-time high. So it is
Hmm.
refreshing to hear, you know, how you're approaching this, how you're approaching this ensemble and making it safe and supportive for people. And, you know, it's important because, you know, for a lot of people that are, I would say probably maybe 65 and older, they were taught you can't make mistakes. Mistakes means failure. But yet the
Yeah.
younger generations were encouraged to make mistakes and they were told you learn by making mistakes. You learn by your failures as opposed to failure means you're a bad person. So that's another dynamic that you're also probably dealing with as well.
Yeah, that's huge. And exactly what you said. When I see people taking the music personally, that's a huge issue. You know, you have, and like that's even something I struggle with in my own practice and in my own, you know, performing career is like I have to remember that if I go out and play and I have a bad night, you know, I'm still who I am, you know, it the same way that like having a great night and having an awesome gig where I play my butt off doesn't mean I'm a good person, doesn't mean I'm cool. You know, it just means I had, you know, I went out there and I did my job, you know. So anytime, you know, either myself or one of my students is like, oh man, like I just feel really bad about how I played and all that, you know, I say like, and I tell myself this too, is I'm just like, breathe, give yourself time to process. If you need to like lay low for a minute and just let it sink in, do it. But then once, that sort of clarity comes back to you, you need to not only keep things moving and being prepared for the next one, but also when you're ready, go back and identify, okay, what could I have done to make sure that doesn't happen? It doesn't need to be a personal attack when something bad happens. It's low risk. We're not brain surgeons out here. I I say that to my students all the time. I mean, we're just out here spitting into tubes. Like,
That's
you
awesome.
know,
But listen, I have to say this, that what you just shared was priceless because and the way you said it too, taking music personally. I do the same thing, a lot of people do. But the thing what can really set you back is really taking it so personally that you play a solo and you make a wrong note and it's like, oh my god, the world's going to end. I have a background as social worker as well. I have a master's in social work degree, and I did that for a number of years. And one of the people that I worked for, Roberta Nash, was a great person, and I used to work in senior centers, and she said to me, Donna, it's okay to make mistakes. The most important thing to remember, as long as no one's died, you're okay. Now I worked in a senior center, so you understand, why she would say
yeah,
that, but it's
definitely.
it's true. If no one's dying, it's okay.
Yeah, yeah. And
So
that's such a valuable thing to carry with you everywhere.
yeah.
It's some of these are some of the values that we talk about in the rehearsal room that carry on to every other facet of life.
Yeah, and it's funny, I just remember growing up in high school, my English AP English teacher was like, in English as in life. And it's like
Mm,
in
mm.
music as in life, because the thing is, the lessons that you learn shedding in the practice room or being in a rehearsal or being on stage, those lessons can transport to other areas of your life, for sure. And if you're able to feel comfortable and confident playing in front of other people, in front of strangers, that should build your confidence for other areas of your life as well. And I think it's a really important point for everybody to kind of internalize and stuff.
Yeah.
So this is awesome. I'm glad we took this turn because I think there's some definitely great gems when it came to that. And but let's talk. We're going to backtrack a little bit. So let's talk about like your performing career and stuff like that. You've been teaching for a long
Sure.
time, since 16 and all that kind of thing. When did the performances start for you?
I still remember the first time I got paid to play music, and it was with the saxophone quartet, and it was a gig at a nursing home. And I remember getting the check, of course. I'm like giddy, oh, it's money with my name on it. That's cool. And then getting what was really the cherry on top was getting a note from one of the residents saying like, hey, like we're glad you're here. You guys sounded great. Thanks for like brightening our day. And that was just like such a moving experience for me. And that kind of set a flame in me for sure. And so that was around my senior year of high school, right when I was, kind of gearing up to do both classical and jazz saxophone. But the gigging really started to take off around 2021. I starting in like late high school, early undergrad, I started to sub with a 50s style jump blues band called the Rhythm Rockets. And it was just like local bar gigs, playing I was playing Barry too. Um and so it was like three horn players, a singer, and then, guitar, bass, drums. And it was a really great experience. And then around the age of 20, I got asked to join the band full time. And so, I lasted a year with them. I got fired from the band, which was that's another interesting story to unpack here. But that's sort of, that was my first taste of the lifestyle. Like for me, like living in the suburbs of Chicago and like driving into the Loop on a Friday night to go play jazz in like a dimly lit club as a 20-year-old, I thought that was the coolest thing ever. And I still think it's the coolest thing ever. You know.
Some people after a while it's like, oh.
Yeah.
But you
And
have
like,
you have to share that story though. How did you get fired?
yeah, this is a good one. So, you know, throughout the time I was with the band, I would get criticized a lot for my soloing. In particular, they would always say, "Kyle, man, you play too many notes and you don't play loud enough." So I was really trying. I was working on it. I started transcribing guys like Coleman Hawkins and Illinois Jaquette and a little bit of Lester, although he gets a little busier. And then I bought this really gnarly metal Berg Larson piece for Barry, just so I could squeal on that thing. Um, so I was working on it, but I think I just never got quite to the level that the band leader was expecting. Granted, he he was great, and he had high expectations for me, and I respect that a lot. And unfortunately, there was some arguments that would go on, just like light banter. These guys, older guys, especially like in the intermissions and like in the rehearsals, they would kind of get at each other sometimes and kind of bicker with each other. And there was one night we were on a gig where the band leader started picking on one of the other saxophone players. Granted that the other saxophone players were, in their 50s and 60s, they were older guys as well. But in the during the intermission, they they started getting into it backstage, and um, I don't remember exactly how, but somehow I got dragged into this argument, and I started sticking up for the other tenor player. And the band leader turns to me at one point. He just goes, "Got your check?" And I'm like, "Yep." He's like, "All right, get out of here. You're done." And so
Wow.
I didn't even play the second set. I got sent home during the intermission. I'll never forget. I was packing my horn up. I'm like, it was my first real gig too. Like, granted, the adrenaline was pumping because I was heated up. Um, but I'm packing up, and the bass player comes up to me, and he's like, "What happened, man? Why are you packing up? We got another set." And I'm like, "I just got fired." And he just goes, "Oh, all right."
Oh,
That was
okay.
that was it. And then I get in the car, and I'm like crying on the ride home. It was it was a really stressful moment for me, but I learned a lot, not only about um really making sure I'm putting in the work to play at the level that whoever hires me expects me to play at. But at the same time, it was also a moment of, okay, I think it was about time I got out of there. There was some nastiness going on, people saying unkind things to each other. And all in all, it was probably for the best.
I was just about to say that. It's so funny. The general public glorifies being in a band, and if you're, and granted, when a lot of bands, it's fun. It's a fun experience. But there are times when it's not the right fit, or
Yes.
there's just like you said, there's a lot of nastiness going on that the public doesn't see, but it's happening in the background, and that can really wear on you mentally, emotionally, and physically. And when you're in that kind of situation, you have to recognize it first. And you have to
Yes.
say to yourself, do I want to keep going through this?
Hmm.
Because the thing is, if this stuff is happening at intermissions during shows, that energy does get out there into the audience.
100%, 100%. The audience can very easily read the energy of the performer. They could be playing like the baddest thing, like the hippest lines or whatever. But if you don't look like you're having fun out there, the audience is gonna know, and their energy is going to adjust accordingly.
Oh, there's no
And
question about that. Yeah, there's no
yeah,
question because they're going to sniff it out from a mile away.
yeah.
And it's interesting. I just want to interject with a story from my own past too. I remember I was helping out a friend in college, and I would sit in on his jazz band at the college that he was teaching. And there were two levels of jazz bands, and the level he wanted me to sit in on was the lower level and stuff like that because there weren't enough people to play. But the interesting thing was that, some audience member said to me, "Oh, yeah, that first band, man, everybody was having a great time. And then the band you were in, everybody looked like they were like dying." They were like, it's like, they were like, they didn't want to be there. And the audience
Yeah,
felt
yeah.
that. And I never forgot that, and the lessons learned from, I'm so glad you shared the story because there's a few things. Number one, the chemistry, everybody's not going to be best friends in a band, but the chemistry is so important. That's the first thing. The second thing, based on what you said also, the different genres of music, the different styles require people to be authentic to that style. And, if you've got a bebop background and all of a sudden you're playing jump blues and all that kind of thing, or even just like old style R&B, you can't be throwing out bebop lines. It's just
Yeah.
the audience will be like, no, please
Yeah,
go.
it's inappropriate. Yeah. And I was completely guilty of that. I'm not gonna lie, and it took me a while to really sort of realize that, okay, the way I improvise needs to be, appropriate to the style of music I was playing, especially during that time where, it was really when I got to college that, I was transcribing every day and, learning bird solos, learning cannonball, train, and it was during that time that I'm like, every gig I go to, I just got to show everyone how much cannonball I've been learning, like listen to me shred and all of that. And so it took me a while, probably longer than the average bear, to really sort of develop a sense of tastefulness, But that was a really great learning moment for me, in that I walked away from that and I was like, okay, all beef aside, all these arguments aside, there was still a reason I got fired, and it had to do with my playing, and that was a problem that I needed to address. So, like I was saying earlier about like dealing with adversity, I gave it the time, I sat with it, I cried about it, and I got it out of my system. But then I went back and I said, okay, now I need to really dial in how I approach improvising in different contexts. Not everything is, not everything is improvising like a jazz musician, and I've learned that now more than ever as I'm playing in all these different bands. Like, Tuesday I was just playing with a rock band doing like Billy Cobham and, doing my Stanley Turrentine impressions. And then the weekend, 2 days before that, I was, playing an Indian wedding, doing Bollywood and Malayalam music.
Yeah, and I'm so glad I want to go down this route for a second, but I just wanted to say this. Listen, we've all gone through this, everybody, like especially if you go into music school and you're on high gear working on all these, classic master solos and whatnot, and then you get your first cover gigs. And it's not going to, most of the time, it's not going to be standards. It's not going to be jazz, some people will,
Hmm.
but a lot of people don't. You're playing cover bands because cover bands tend to make a little bit more money. And
Yes.
the thing is that it's not about how much you shed, it's about honoring the music that you're playing. And it takes all of us quite a bit, to get comfortable with that. It's not just you. Um, but I'm glad we spoke about that too, because the other thing that I'm so glad you mentioned is the band dynamic. And just to add to that, just for a second, it's also what you bring into that as well,
Yes.
like your expectations, because if you are, trained and then you're joining this band where people are mostly self-taught, there's also that dynamic too. There can be a little bit of resentment, and you just have to be
Yes.
mindful of that and not be above, above everybody. Everybody has their own value in a band.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And, that it reminds me of the notion that, your playing is maybe 40% of the gig. You know, you got to be able to make the hang. You got to be professional. You got to show up on time. You got to show up ready for what if what if they don't have an extension cord for you to plug your amp into. I say that as I've been playing with pedals a lot, so that's been a thing, But, I try to just, especially in the modern age, just crossing my T's and dotting all my I's. I owe a lot of the calls I've gotten just to not only me being punctual, but showing up to the gig and be like, hey man, how's your day going? Like, it's good to see you. What's new with you? Rather than, talking all music all the time, We gotta be we're humans too, and I feel like a band operates together better when there's more balance.
It's a great point. That's an awesome point. All right. Now I'm going to go into that other path that you mentioned, because I was really curious in reading your bio that, you've, how was this put over here? There were traditional Indian musical idioms and also playing Bollywood music. Can we go down that path? Because I've not had anybody talk about this on the podcast yet.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, my journey down the path of Indian music really started in 2021 when I started to pick up some Indian wedding gigs. I have a friend out here in Chicago who's a drummer. He's actually the drummer on Monarch, Kabir Dalwari. And we've been, he's one of my closest musical comrades, one of my closest friends, been playing since 2018. But eventually, back in 2021, he started to invite me to play some of these Indian wedding gigs. And so going into it, it was just me and the DJ. And I had no say in what the DJ was playing. I just heard the songs and was literally making up background parts. I have relative pitch, so I can hear what key it's in. And so I would make stuff up based on, what key it's in and, sort of what the vibe is. But as I kept going with that, of course, the first one was a disaster, right? Just kind of it was really a trial by fire moment. Um, but thankfully it was a house party. It was low pressure.
Oh, good.
But, you know, as as I went on and I was like, okay, this is some really beautiful music and I want to do some more of this. You know, I just had, some of my South Asian friends send me different playlists of some exclusively Bollywood, which is North Indian, some a playlist of Punjabi music, playlist of Malaya music, which is South Indian. And so I just started chipping away, learning the melodies of these songs the same way I learned jazz standards. Just, trying to put the melody on the horn. I've never put any of these tunes on paper. I've just learned the melody enough and, have a reasonable oral understanding of the harmonic functions that I can go in there, play along with the singers, play the melody. When there's space, I play a couple lines, but largely, you know, playing lines is not very conducive to that music unless it's in very specific situations. Kind of like what we were just talking about, like, contextually appropriate improvisation. So, most of the time I'm really like I'll play the melody a little bit and then I'll just play pads behind some of the instrumental parts.
Got it. Okay. And yeah, let's talk a little bit more about this too. For those people that want to get into particularly Bollywood style, I think, because I tend to see, a lot of gig requests for that. So
Yes.
if you could share any tips, places to look or, I was thinking playlist ideas and stuff like that, but people to listen to, that can help.
Yeah, I mean, you you got to look at some of like the fixtures of that music. Like the first person that comes to mind is like Dollar Mendy, and while he kind of bridges the gap a little bit between Bollywood and Punjabi styles. He is a household name in a lot of the North Indian tradition. So learning his music is great. Um, I recommend, there are a lot of instrumental covers of these songs on YouTube, and a lot of the musicians on those covers are individuals I've never really heard of before. But, I'll just scroll through. Obviously, some are not going to be as high quality as others in terms of the musicianship, but hearing someone's approach to it that already exists on, sometimes it's saxophone, sometimes it's piano, sometimes it's something else. But having an instrumental approach to check out really does can help heighten your awareness of real of for me what's most important is knowing the contour of the melody. What direction is it pushing in? You're not gonna, you don't want to, well, ideally we'd like to play every single note perfectly, but especially when you're like on the gig and you're getting asked to play music you haven't heard before, that's just not very realistic. So my advice is that the more of the style you can check out and internalize and especially learn the grooves, learn the beats, it's huge. That's so huge because that can really help you, intensify your rhythmic approach to the music. Just like in the same way we learn jazz, the way we learn what the ride patterns are, learn what a bell pattern is, learn clave. It's the same way with Indian music. I'm very fortunate that I have some friends who are very deeply involved in it, and Kabir in particular is a very great dolly as well. You know, so when I listen to him, play those beats, I'm kind of just like drumming along with my hands. Obviously I don't have like the drum technique to like replicate it well, but I know the functionality of the groove. I know how these melodies fit within the groove. And so now that I've had that, I combine it with my understanding of the contour of the melody to, start putting the two together and build, a comprehensive product. Because while the saxophone is a beautiful thing in that it's the most, I think it does one of the best jobs at emulating the human voice, it's still not going to be perfect. Things are still going to sound a little bit rigid, especially with Bollywood music. Bollywood music is so melismatic. You know, you might hear a singer singing on a neutral syllable in like singing like all these slides and really, really interesting lines, and so that's where I say, don't don't overanalyze exactly every rhythm that's happening. Just, listen to it, learn like it's the whole think it, say it, play it, keep listening to it until you can sing it back and then just learn to replicate it as if you're singing through your instrument. Don't think, okay, this is the and a one or this is a whatever chord because that's not gonna that doesn't really work in this context.
That's awesome. That's great advice. And I think it's going to give people a really great start. And I wanted to go back. You meant Dollar Mundi. I didn't quite catch that person's name.
Yes.
How do you
Yeah,
how
yeah.
do you spell that?
Um, Here, I'm pulling it up right now. Dalermehndi, Dollar Mendy.
Got it. Okay, cool. And this way, people will know to look for that as one possible, way for getting context into this, into the style of music and stuff like that. And I always talk about like, yeah, you have to do a lot of listening and listen to the nuances, because that's
Yes.
what makes music different, each style different and stuff like that. And that's the thing that can't be notated.
Yeah, and this is where like deep listening really comes into the conversation. Going back and I would listen to these songs. I'd listen to the same song for an hour and just like trying to hear different things every time. Sometimes I'm listening for the melodic contour. Sometimes I'm listening for the groove. Sometimes I'm listening to hear the discrepancies. I'm like, okay, what is intentional here, and what is someone like just like botching a note, or like what nuances of the lines do I need to really care about?
Yeah, and actually, when you say discrepancies too, is it an intentional tension, or is it, or it's just a mistake or whatever?
Yeah, right, right. And especially when you're dealing with, non-Western music, it's easy to miscategorize something as a mistake when it's really a very intentional dissonance or something of the sort.
And that's where it goes back to, huh, it goes back to understanding the genre, the culture,
hmm
and
And
like,
that's why just the more listening, the more you're gonna have this repertory of like, okay, this is like there are certain lines that are it's like learning licks, it's like, all right, this particular line you see it everywhere, or this particular groove or this particular harmonic sequence. It's the same way as learning the you know the most idiomatic functions of the music.
yeah, and it keeps you, again, being authentic, to this different styles and stuff like that. And so
Yeah.
now let me go into another direction here for a second, and let's talk about, you're performing, you had a couple of the Bollywood types of gigs, all that type of thing. And how did your performance experience lead you to the release? Your album just released, I guess, I guess couple of days ago or a few weeks ago or something like that.
Yeah,
Yes,
it'll be a week tomorrow.
yes, as we're recording this in mid-October 2024. Let's talk about what led up to the album.
Yeah, definitely. So, it's interesting because the album was recorded just about a year ago. It was recorded in October of 23, and I had written most of that music that year. While it is my debut album, I have a pretty large base of older compositions that, there are some I still want to go back and record, but I feel like this batch of compositions was the most uh representative of where I was at artistically in the moment. And so, it's funny you mentioned the connection between, the Indian music in both Bollywood and Malayalam, Punjabi. Um, I was doing a lot more of those gigs than I was doing right now. And, almost every weekend in the summer, I was doing a different Indian wedding. Some of them I would travel for, but a lot of them were local in Chicago. Um, the biggest musical influence that music had on my own, compositional style, I think is the freedom and flexibility in which, the singers, execute these lines. There's so much ebb and flow, and everything is very relaxed, especially with these melismatic functions, right? That all these notes are happening, all these rhythms are happening, but no one's ever making a big deal out of it. It's just a part of the texture, but it doesn't have to be, you don't have to come out screaming every time you play a 16th note, you know what I mean? And I had that in the back of my mind as I wrote a lot of this music, in that there are a lot of really like subtleties. Like there's some tracks that have 5 bar phrases. There's a song in 5/4. There's some songs with some really interesting harmonic functions. But I try to be a little coy with it, if you know what I mean. Just making it making it all part of the narrative and less a novelty.
Got it. Okay. Okay. So that it's more part of the whole. It's not like, oh, look at this, I'm just throwing this in.
Exactly, exactly. Because that was a big issue. Well, that was a big comment I was getting from some of my teachers I was showing my compositions to, is that they they all had a they all would say, your compositions feel rigid. You would play this cool line, and then you just throw this random thing in there, and it would last like a couple bars, and then you'd go back to something else. You know, Streamlining and letting things develop is, a huge tip that I was getting from my teachers in composition, namely Greg Ward. He was definitely a really bright spot in my compositional study, and he's absolutely brilliant when it comes to letting these ideas unfold both harmonically and melodically, and making sure that everything is dovetailed together, everything serves a purpose. If you want sections that are rigid and jarring, like that's fine, but make sure it's purposeful. You know what I mean? Those were some of the comments that I was getting.
And that actually, I'm just thinking of, as you're speaking about this too, this is also great advice for improvisation.
Yeah,
Same thing.
100%. 100%. I mean, improvisation, spontaneous composition, right?
Yeah.
Um, really, and it's funny you mentioned that too, because some of the songs on the album were just generated by me putting on the voice memo on my phone, improvising for a little while, and then I'd go back and listen. I'd hear something I like, and be like, okay, this sounds cool. I like this idea I played here. Let me go back and try to develop. And then I go back and develop it a little more and a little more. And eventually it would lead to a full-fledged composition.
When you did that, and this is a question that I often ask of people that, have original compositions out there, what comes to you first, melody or harmonies or rhythm?
Mm. You know, it's different almost every time. There's almost always one core concept that informs the rest of the tune. But, like for the title tune on the track Chrysalis, the core concept of that tune was the gung 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 gung, that 5/4 thing, and that led to everything developing. And it's funny I say that, because while that was the core rhythm of the song, the A sections aren't even in five, you know. So it was a matter of trying to create this contrast, right? So I think the rhythm, or not the rhythm, but the influence can come from a number of different places, depending on exactly what I'm thinking at the time, or at least what is influencing or inspiring these compositions. I've come to notice, especially recently, how a lot of my compositions are being influenced by specific songs. I'll hear a particular song, and I'm like, I like this idea here. Let me write a composition that stems from this particular idea. And not trying to like copycat it, but write something inspired by it.
So inspired by I guess inspired by maybe the concept of the song or yeah, can you elaborate on that?
Sure, sure, yeah. It can be really any part of the song. I mean, for me, I think a lot of it right now, because I've been writing not a lot, but a little bit since, recording since releasing the album. And I've noticed that the influences that I'm looking at right now, I like to take from, the overall vibe or the energy or the aesthetic nature of a song. If something's got like there's a song I wrote recently that was inspired by a Fleet Foxes song, and Fleet Foxes is like folksy, pretty like art songy, dark, mysterious undertones, you know, and the the core rhythm that I wrote for that melody um it didn't line up with anything particularly noted in the song other than just what I thought was most relative to the energy of that Fleet Foxes song. Now we're getting pretty subjective, but I hope that makes kind of sense.
Yeah, no, it does. And this is interesting too, because I haven't thought about it in this way in terms of, you know, um, being inspired by a song, not just the melody, but the energy of it, the energy
Yeah.
of it. And for some people, it could be the instrumentation of it. But it's interesting when you said, Fleet Foxes. I think I've heard that's a group, right? That's a
Yeah,
group.
yeah.
Yeah, I think I on Sirius Radio. But it was funny. I was thinking to myself, oh wait, that dark, mysterious stuff. That goes back to like what his dad was listening to when he was younger.
Yeah,
And I was just
yeah.
thinking about that too, how that kind of came full circle.
Seriously. Yeah. Yeah, it's you mentioned that and I haven't really thought of that before, but it's obvious I'm a product of my influence.
Yeah, we all are. Although, unfortunately for me, like my parents had no. I'd, I'd be in the car and they'd be listening to. I'm from New York, and they'd be listening to CBS 101. It was all the oldie stuff, but it wasn't like it wasn't even so much Frank Sinatra or anything like that. It was just like, I don't know, just like oldies pop. And my sister and I would be like crying in the back because we just wanted to hear, the more popular music at the time. So
Mhm.
we didn't have any influence of that whatsoever. But it's funny because, with you and with a whole bunch of other guests too, just the influence of what music was around in the house when you were growing up and how that affected how that affects your playing, your writing, approach, all that kind of thing.
Yeah, and especially with this like industrial underground thing that like seemingly so unrelated to jazz, but it turns around and as I learned more about the music and just about music in general and culture in general, seeing just like, the subtle connections get built up over time, you know, and it and like these days, I'm listening to more like folk music and Americana than I'm listening to jazz right now. It just happened. I'm not saying that to diminish jazz at all. It just happens to be the phase I'm in right now. I still go back and listen to my Joe Henn records, on a pretty regular basis. But, you know, I see myself compositionally moving towards that style. And I think it's evident in parts of Monarch too, the parts that are less, jazz influenced and more influenced by folk and Americana. I list I was asked my influences for that record and I listed like Terrace Martin, Ben Wendell, and Marquise Hill, and those are guys who are definitely experts when it comes to blurring the lines a little bit. Not
Mm.
that it was I and it wasn't my intention to come out and be like, I'm gonna write an album that blurs the line between jazz and da da da. No, I just wanted to write music that I felt I wanted to write, music that was my style, And so just in the past few years of listening and practicing, those guys were, at the top of my listening list, almost very, very consistently over the past 3, 4 years.
I'm curious. Yeah, I'm curious. Like now, you're kind of keying in on folk, Americana, all that kind of stuff. I've always loved the singer-songwriter, singer-songwriters and stuff like that. I'm curious if your writing as of now is starting to reflect that.
Yeah, 100%. I actually just started writing lyrics this summer. I started a vocal group called In Bloom about we've only played 2 gigs now, but we started playing together in the summer. Um, So, as the band has evolved, I've been we started by doing mostly covers, but I started writing lyrics, which was definitely a step outside my comfort zone. I'd never done that before this year, you know. So sort of combining the two was a challenge for me, but that's a product of my influence, like I listen to so much Joni Mitchell and, Phoebe Bridgers and, Big Thief and Adrienne Lenker, you know, and if it wasn't for, those people and influencing my listening so much, that that would have never come out in my writing like it is right now.
That's so cool. And
Yeah.
even tracing back a little bit when I was making the connection between like what you were exposed to with like what your father was listening to and whatnot, and then like the dark stuff with that. It reminded me of one of the podcast interviews with Marvin,
Mm.
the group Marvin, and
Yeah,
I'm
yeah.
thinking about like, and they played a show out here in Los Angeles, which was so cool to see them live, but it just reminded me that's like rock, but with jazz heavily influenced by rock, and it's
Hmm.
just they have a huge fan base and all that kind of stuff, and it's just so cool to see how jazz is evolving if people let it.
Yes, exactly. I mean, that's a that's a huge like culture conflict right now for sure, and that it's like kind of the old head versus the new head sort of method, You see, because you see some jazz acts that out there nowadays that are very like traditional suit and tie, and and while there's so much merit to that for sure, there that shouldn't be an excuse to diminish people who are trying to you know push the envelope and create new music that's not quite jazz, but a term I've used before is jazz adjacent music, and it's funny. I use that term to describe one of my gigs that I posted on Facebook. And one of my professors, who was like on his way out, about to retire, posted a pretty cranky post being like, these kids saying things like jazz adjacent. And he used the verbiage exactly. It was definitely a shot at me. And he's like, these kids using the word jazz adjacent, man, they don't know what they're doing. Like that word means nothing to me. I'm like, that word is going to mean something different to everybody. So, who are you to poo-poo that?
Yeah, and this is interesting because I just interviewed Asha Parkinson, and she's in the UK. She's also young. She's in her 20s and that kind of thing. She was composing music since the age of, like 11, 12, and that kind of thing. And it's jazz music influenced by world music. And so
Mm,
her thing was combining religions, Christian, Jewish, and Islamic. And so her father, influenced by her father, who was a storyteller, but he used Islamic style music and instruments in his storytelling, that influenced her, and that
mm.
influences her music, and it's like the same thing with you, that little connection between, like some of the stuff that your father was listening to, but also the types of gigs you landed, you kind of like fell into, with the Bollywood style, the Indian style weddings and gigs and all that kind of thing, and getting exposed to that and starting to really listen to it, to internalize it, to understand the nuances of it. And now, you're coming into your own space, your own, and your own, yeah, I guess your own space and that kind of thing, and showing how that music's influencing you. Now the folk Americana music's coming in, and it's going to be interesting to see, in the next number of years and stuff like that, how all of these divergent cultures, and especially with the jazz standards and like the heroes from the past and all that, and how that's going to shape you as a composer and a player.
Yeah, 100%. Because that, my experience with like the Indian tradition and the jazz tradition, those are never going to leave me. However deep I may get into, the folk thing, it's always going to be a part of my compositional voice. So I agree with you and I appreciate that because I'm also excited to see sort of how these things come together and create new concepts. And, those are some of the things I'm already working on as I'm already starting to think about, what the next record is going to be like. And, it's going to involve vocals in one sort or another and definitely be influenced more so by the folk Americana thing while still holding on to my own, jazz and world music sensibilities.
I was going to ask you, that was actually going to be my next question. Like, what are your next projects that you're working on right now? So it sounds like this next album, and when you say there's going to be vocals on it, does that mean that you're also going to be composing the lyrics as well?
That's the goal. Yeah. The couple songs I've already written lyrics for, I've been fortunate enough to already put them on gigs and, play put it in front of a band, and I'm happy with the direction it's going. Obviously, it's gonna be some time. I still gotta recover financially from this endeavor. Um, but the the sort of the artistic direction I'm trending towards, in my mind, is very clear to me, because this sort of music. I don't want to say it fell in my lap recently, because I mean, especially with Joni, I'd been listening to her music for maybe like a year or two. And then earlier this year, I played in a band I just finished my doctoral coursework at Indiana. And while I was there, I was playing with a band of students, and we were doing instrumental versions of like Bon Iver and Fleet Foxes and all these musicians I was just talking about. Like, we did a Phoebe Bridgers tune. You know, that was kind of a catalytic moment for me, in that I was like, man, where is it? I remember saying to myself, I was like, man, where's all this beautiful music been all my life?
Yeah, I was just thinking. So I have to ask, you never heard Joni Mitchell before, I guess, a year or so ago, or I'm just generalizing.
I had heard of her in different contexts. Well, actually, I remember how I first heard of Joni Mitchell. It was 2019, so not that long ago. Um, and every year around Thanksgiving, I go up to Toledo and I play in this Last Waltz tribute band. You know about the Last Waltz? It's like that. It was this big concert that happened on Thanksgiving in I believe, the late 70s, and it was like this all-star concert, like Neil Young and Bob Dylan leading the band. But Joni Mitchell made an appearance. All these superstars came in, like BB King, Muddy Waters, and there's recordings, there's an album of this concert on everywhere you stream or buy music. But it's like 2 hours long, and it's just an extravaganza that features all these individual artists. And on the record, they do a live version of Coyote with Joni. And I remember, like, going in, it was a mad dash to learn all this music. There were like 35 songs I had to learn. And I got tasked with making the horn charts. And so I was like, it was pretty daunting. But I remember that's where I heard Coyote for the first time. And I was like, oh my God, this is beautiful. And that's what led me into Hajira. And I was obsessed with that album specifically for a good like 2, 3 years there. And then only recently I turned around and started listening to Blue in the same manner, just like I recently got obsessed with that album as well.
It's
But it took me
interesting.
a while.
Well, no, but what's really interesting though, a lot of music that came out of the 70s was, I was just about to say really ahead of its time, but no, it was the right time for that. Yet, what happened in the 80s was that we kind of like went the opposite direction, you know?
Mm,
Because the music, some of the music in the 70s, I'm talking about the pop music actually, where, it was beautiful stories, it was songs, it was some intricate harmonies and that kind of thing, some of the music. And yet we kind of lost that, as we got into maybe the later 70s, early 80s and stuff like that, the stuff you hear on the radio and that kind of thing. Um, but it's interesting. There's so much out there. There's so much gold out there in terms of,
yeah.
artists, especially for the younger people listening to this podcast right now. Like there's some serious artists you should listen to, from the 70s. I'm not just talking about jazz masters. I'm just talking popular music, because it did
Mhm.
influence a lot of people. And now to this day, you can see that right here.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And if it wasn't for me taking this random rock band gig, that I remember when I first took it, I was like, they got no charts. They want me to learn all this music. I was like, "Ugh, I don't know about this one." But I took the chance and I dove in and I learned that music, and I learned so much about the history in the process that, that's what really led to me, falling in love with, with that specific idiom of the music.
That's really cool. And
Yeah.
again, it's probably going to influence you even more so later on as you're writing more music, with your next projects and stuff. So we
Yeah.
talked about like next projects in terms of writing. In terms of playing, like are you promoting your album? Do you have concerts for that? Like what are you doing with that?
Yeah, we had 3 release shows last week in Chicago. Was really happy with how those went. Right now, as I just picked up a new class at Triton, so that's been shifted. That my focus is shifted to that for the next couple weeks. But we're playing the music again. We have 2 shows in the fall coming up. One at Fulton Street Collective, and then another, not confirmed yet, but at Chicago Music Lounge. We're working something out right now. So I'm hoping to keep it going with promoting it. Definitely, this is just the beginning. I was really happy with how those release shows went, but I'm still working on getting this music to more ears.
And yeah, let me ask you, first of all, for the listeners here, how can they purchase? How can they find your music?
Sure, yeah. The music is on, it's available streaming for free on Apple Music and Spotify. I really want to recommend checking out. I have 2 music videos up on YouTube, one for Chrysalis and one for Friends in High Places. Those were the 2 singles. Um, really happy with how those turned out. So check them out. They're fun. The cinematic style is very experimental. Nick Zulek was the producer for those videos, and he did a phenomenal job on those. And so I highly recommend checking those out. We also have CDs for sale on Bandcamp. I hired Ben Seville, who's a graphic artist from the UK, to do the album art. He did a beautiful job, and the rest of the album art, I think it warrants purchasing the CD. And I don't say that as the person who designed it. I say that as an art connoisseur myself, who just appreciates having a very nice, clean, interesting package to look at while you're listening to the music.
Cool. I love physical products. I love physical CDs.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I do have a whole bunch of MP3s, but there's something said for actually holding on to having the CD. And there's, people that love the actual vinyl, and I
Mm,
remember getting vinyl and, you had the inserts in there and you had, the descriptions and a lot of that you lose when you get MP3s. You don't know what's going on. You don't get any of that, the backstory or sometimes you don't even know who's playing on the album. That's the
yeah.
more annoying thing when it comes to
You
that.
know, I got a quick little story about that. Why you should This is a PSA on why you should read the liner notes. So when I was at Bowling Green, Ben Wendell was our guest artist, right? And so I picked him up, and I was his chauffeur for the weekend and whatnot. And I getting ready for it, I was like, man, I'm gonna have all this cool music queued up, and I'm gonna show him all this great stuff that I've been listening to. And where I was driving him home from the concert, driving him back to the hotel, and I put on this Gerald Clayton song, and it's a beautiful like vocal song. Um, and I was like, oh, and we were both listening to it, and he's like, man, this song's so beautiful. And I'm like, yeah, have you checked this out before? And he's like, I produced it.
Oh,
And I was like, oh, I was so embarrassed. That's why you read the liner notes.
that's great. I love that. All right. Well, listen, let as we're winding down, I wanted to thank you for your time and you're being gracious with it. Where can people find you online?
Sure. My handle is Kyle Brooks Saxophone on Instagram. I'm on YouTube as Kyle Brooks 56. I'm also just look me up on SoundCloud as well. Um, and yeah, that I mean, most of my activity is localized to Instagram. I'm also on TikTok, Kyle Brooks Saxophone there. So check it out.
Got it. TikTok, and we're going to put all these links in the show notes, everybody. And what we're also going to do is we're going to look for the 2 music videos on YouTube and put those in the links section as well. So this way, people, will be able to access that, and you're going to see that on our saxophonepodcast.com website, along with his bio and a bunch of other things. And during the audio of this podcast, I also like to share the artists songs and stuff. So I'll be sharing a couple of songs from Monarch, as background music as I'm giving the introduction and the outro and stuff like that. So definitely check that out as well. Listen, Kyle, I wanted to thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much for having me, Donna. It was really a pleasure to get to sit down and talk with you today.
My pleasure as well. I learned so much, and just from the conversations that we had, I think this is going to be really valuable to the listeners. Thanks again.
Thank you. Appreciate it.